my 73 years. But this was some ugly stuff today. So hopefully we can relax and go to Alaska and forget about the snow. So I'll share the screen here. Let's see, how do I get to the top of this thing? Okay, everybody seeing that? All right.
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Back. Okay, well, we'll get started. Of course, Carol and I have been thinking about this trip for a long time, and we'd hoped to do this trip in the summer of 2020. And of course, that's when we got hit by COVID, and Alaska was, or Canada actually, was closed for 2 years. You couldn't get into Canada 2020 and 2021. So we finally made the trip this summer. Gave us a lot of time to do some planning. We looked at a lot of maps and so forth. And one thing, if anybody's thinking about going to Alaska, one thing I'd really recommend is this booklet that they call the Milepost. It's, well, it's huge. It's about an inch thick, but it's really helpful. It has maps of all the different routes into Alaska, and it starts in Western Canada from Edmonton west, and it shows all the routes into Alaska and then all the routes in Alaska. And it goes mile by mile, and it tells you where the campgrounds are, where the gas stations are, where the grocery stores are, the different attractions to see. And it's full of all kinds of maps. It's really, really helpful. It saved the day for us. And then we also carried paper maps. The one thing we found out in Alaska, about 90% of the time you do not have cell phone coverage, so you can't depend on your cell phone. So it's good to have some hard copy maps around. So that's kind of the planning for the trip. And this is the route that we took. The green line, or the red line, is the route that we took back. The green line is the route that we took out to Alaska. And you'll see that we went out to the middle of North Dakota, and then we went north into Canada from there, across Saskatchewan and Alberta to Edmonton, and then we headed west from Edmonton into British Columbia. And you'll see there's several places there where we drop down to the coast, and where the little green lines go down to the coast along southeast Alaska there. And then where those two lines are is Skagway and Haines. We'll talk more about that. And then we got finally actually into Alaska, and we got down into the Kenai Peninsula, and then from there we went back up to Fairbanks, and north of Fairbanks up to the Arctic Circle, and then our return route was the red line. And so the slides that you're going to see are going to be kind of in the order of how we traveled out to Alaska and back. And the one thing we figured out when we started looking at the maps, let's see, I got to get my notes here so I can see them, is that it's a long ways to Alaska. And we actually spent almost as much time driving in Canada as we did in Alaska, and definitely a lot more miles in Canada. And so it's quite a trip, and it took us 10 weeks, and that was comfortable. We got to see pretty much everything we wanted to see, but it's surprising how much time you can use taking a trip like this. So a few trivia things that we learned about Alaska that I wanted to start out with here. And one is which animal in Alaska causes more harm to humans each year? And you hear a lot about the bears, and of course they got a lot of caribou and a lot of moose in Alaska. And it turns out that moose is actually the animal that causes more harm to people in Alaska. And of course, there's a lot of moose in Alaska and a lot of people living in remote areas where those moose are. And you see these signs all over the place warning you about especially a cow moose with a calf. And so it was kind of interesting. We didn't run into any angry cow moose, but apparently they're out there. So that was one trivia thing we learned, and it's kind of interesting. You don't hear much about that here in Minnesota. I think you hear more about bears than concerns about moose. Of course, we don't have nearly as high a moose population as they do there. So the second thing is which location receives the most daylight hours in a year? And one thing I would note, you can see the Arctic Circle there on the map. And note that above the Arctic Circle, the sun never sets on the summer solstice. And of course, it also never rises on the winter solstice. So what it turns out is the place that gets the most sunlight every year is everywhere gets the same amount of sunlight. That was kind of an interesting fact. I guess I wasn't fully aware of. So where we are, you get the same amount of sunlight in a year. Same hours of sunlight. It just it all comes at different times. If you live towards the equator, you get even days, even night, even days of sunlight every day. And if you live up at the Arctic Circle, it's dark in the winter and light most of the summer. So that was kind of interesting fact. And of course, you hear about the mosquitoes in Alaska. Here's a picture of a couple of the mosquitoes we ran into. And we kind of wondered what the bug problem would be like. We brought our head nets, and as it turned out, we only had to use our head nets just a handful of times. And I would say the bugs there, where we were anyway, were not any worse than what we're used to dealing with here in Minnesota. Now, it's probably different if you're way up on the north slope there in the tundra. I'm sure the mosquitoes can be pretty terrific up there, but where we were, it really wasn't all that bad. The other interesting thing we ran into is we were in a lot of different campgrounds, and almost all of them had wells with water, and almost all of them had a sign like this. It says, "This water is provided for your convenience, but may not meet drinking water standards. For your safety, boil or treat the water." And we saw that in both in Canada and Alaska, almost everywhere we camped. That was something we weren't expecting, so we had to I carried a 3-gallon jug. And whenever we had a chance to fill up with potable water somewhere, we kept that full, and then we used the campground water, for washing and dishes and that kind of thing. So that's one thing that we weren't really expecting. The other thing that we were hoping to see a lot of bears, and we did see some bears. There were lots of signs about watch out for bears, but mostly what we saw is what you see here on the road, and that's a bear pile. And, you don't seem to see that much here in Minnesota, but it was almost everywhere we went in Alaska, you would see bear piles on the road. So, the bears were there, but they were leaving their mark and not showing themselves all that often. The other thing that kind of surprised us is we were expecting to see a lot of birds in Alaska. And when we were along the coast by the ocean, there were a lot of, seabirds and so forth there. But once you got inland, we were surprised. There was really kind of a paucity of bird life. And apparently there's a lot in the spring and the fall migration, but most of the birds are going way up the northern coast and the western coast of Alaska nesting for the summer. And so the interior of Alaska actually was a pretty poor place for bird watching. So that was something we weren't really expecting either. So here we are. This is the first day of our trip, June 15th. About 6 in the morning, we're getting ready to jump in the truck, and the tent trailer is the camper that we use, and head out. And so we're going to be gone for 10 weeks. Over that period, we camped at 37 different campgrounds. The costs for campgrounds range from $5 in federal campgrounds, where we have the Golden Age Pass, and so you get half price. So if you were in a federal campground like Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, Forest Service, it only cost us $5. We also stayed in some private campgrounds, and so the most we had to pay per night was about $62.50. I drove 11,000 miles on my 2015 F-150 there, and I got about 14.8 miles per gallon, which I thought was pretty good, pulling that trailer. Of course, we picked about the worst time ever to travel that far. And buy gas. We went 11,000 miles, and the price of gas averaged about $5.80 per gallon. Gas in Canada especially was really expensive. And the most we had to pay was $7.49. And I'll show you where we paid that price. And we spent about total on the trip about $4,000 on gas. That was our biggest expense. And the total trip cost us just under $11,000, about $10,800. And the rest of the cost was kind of divided equally between food, camping costs, and entertainment or recreation that we did during the trip. So the first day we headed out to North Dakota to Rugby, and then we turned north there. And the first night we camped at the International Peace Gardens. And of course, we started out the first night, it was raining as we set up camp, and they had a really wet spring in North Dakota, and we just lucked out. We reserved a campsite ahead of time because we weren't sure how crowded it would be. Turns out it wasn't crowded at all, but most of the campsites were actually flooded. We just were lucky that we picked one that wasn't flooded. We reserved campsites for the first 4 nights of our trip, and then after that, we just hoped that we would find a campsite. And it turns out we always did. We only had one time really where we got to a campground that was full, and we had to do an alternate plan. So there's plenty of campgrounds, and we didn't have a hard time finding campsites. Although we did try to make camp relatively early in the day, you know, like by between 3 and 4:30 or so. To make sure that we get a campsite. One thing we found here at the Peace Gardens in the morning, we discovered there was, of all things, a phone booth there that actually worked. So you never know what you're going to find when you're traveling. I hadn't seen a phone booth for years, so it was kind of fun to check that out. This is what the Peace Gardens look like from the air. It's Canadian on the right side of the picture there, the US on the left side, and then the border goes right down through the middle of that area, and there's all kinds of flowers planted there. It's really a beautiful site. And of course, we got there early, so there wasn't that much growing yet, but it must be really beautiful in the middle of the summer. It's just kind of a neat area. It celebrates the peaceful boundary that we have between the US and Canada. And here's what it looks like when you're standing right on that line that goes right through the middle of the Peace Gardens. So the next day we headed into Canada, and the first campground in Canada was called Blackstrap Provincial Park. That was in Saskatchewan. We were just south of Saskatoon, about 15 miles for that campground. We had lunch on the way, and here's a 13-line ground squirrel that joined us for lunch. So that was our first big wildlife picture of the trip. And then from there, we headed into Alberta. The next day, we did spend a day in Saskatoon. There's a really nice museum there about the Plains Indians in that part of Canada. And we spent some time there. And then the next day, we headed to Elk Island National Park, which is just west or just east of Edmonton, Alberta. And a really nice park. It's kind of an island of aspen out in the middle of the prairie. And we spent a day visiting that park, and a lot of wildlife there. I got to see, this is a redneck grebe, both splashing in the water here and then on a nest. And then this is a plains bison. They have both plains bison and woods bison at Elk Island National Park. So that was kind of fun to see them. From there then, we made it to Mount Robson Park, and we're now in British Columbia. And this is where we really started to feel like we were getting into the, what northwestern Canada and Alaska was going to look like. All of a sudden, it was really rugged country. And one of the things that we came across the next day, we found this Rearguard Falls just past where we camped. And interesting is this falls marks the upper limit of the salmon migration from the Pacific Ocean, 800 miles from here to the Pacific Ocean, and yet the salmon get all the way up here. And what we found out is that those salmon play a significant role in the ecology of this part of America, North America, that's impacted by the Pacific Ocean, because millions of salmon come up these rivers, and of course they spawn and then die. And that provides a really important food and nutrient source, of course, for bears and scavenging birds and so forth. But then those droppings are deposited on the land, and it actually provides a lot of nutrients for the ecology in an area that is fairly sterile, kind of like the boundary waters, I suppose, in terms of productivity. So it's interesting that those salmon are pretty important to the ecology, something I hadn't thought about before. The next day on our trip, we were heading through a little town and we needed to get some Canadian money. It was New Hazelton, British Columbia. And we found out that the provincial parks in Canada require cash and they would take US money, but the exchange rate was about 80 cents to the dollar. And so we decided we better get some Canadian money, and our GPS led us astray. We went through this little town and then we ended up just by accident at this incredible bridge over what's called the Buckley River in New Hazelton, and just an amazing bridge in this deep canyon. It's one of the tallest suspension bridges in Canada. And it turns out that the native, I think they're called the Hogwilligit people or Hegwilligit people who lived here for centuries before the Europeans got here, actually built a log bridge across this canyon somehow, and they would tie the logs together. So quite an engineering feat considering the tools that they were using. So from here, we now are going to start heading north on what's called the Cassiar Highway. And that's about a 450-mile trip through some really remote country. And there was some beautiful campgrounds. This is called the Mezzadine Lake Provincial Park. And this is where we camped our first night. We're in June 23rd now. And 450 miles, and we found out there's 3 gas stations during that whole distance. And we did buy a 5-gallon spare gas can to keep in the truck just in case we needed it to make it to the next gas station. But it turns out we never did need it. But you do have to keep an eye on your gas tank. And when you see a gas station, you fill up, because there's not a lot of gas stations. And sometimes the ones that are there are closed or not open when you go by. And so it pays to keep the gas tank full. But we never had any real problem. Carol walked out and washed her hair in this lake. And the water in that lake was so cold that it gave her a pretty good headache just washing her hair. So the water had not warmed up much. There wasn't much swimming going on when we were there. So from here, we got there early enough that we had a little time in the afternoon. And of course, the afternoon goes till about 11:30 at night because it stays light. And there was a side trip. There was a little road that goes over to Stewart, British Columbia, which is kind of right on a long inlet that goes out to the Pacific Ocean. And so we decided to take a little trip and see that. And this was the first glacier that we saw. This is called Bear Glacier. And we saw many glaciers as we went through Alaska. And one of the things that was interesting that we learned in Alaska is that above all their glaciers are huge ice fields. So the glaciers are where the ice comes down into the valleys, but above them are these huge ice fields, many times, many square miles, hundreds of square miles in some places large. So a little different than what we're used to, like in Glacier National Park, where the glaciers are pretty much just in a cirque in the mountains. But here there's these huge ice fields above their glaciers. And this is what it looked like when we were in Stewart, British Columbia. And it's on a long finger from the Pacific called the Portland Canal. And so this is kind of an estuary actually. And so this is seawater that's coming in here, and the tides come in and out and flood this area. And there was a really cool boardwalk out in there, and you can see a little bit what the sites look like. And this is actually the ridge on the right side of the picture where I'm standing here by this red bench. That was our first look at Alaska. That's actually the border of Alaska, way down in southeast Alaska. And so we got to look at it, but we didn't quite get there yet. It's actually going to be a while before we get to Alaska. And right around the corner, if you go right around the corner of that ridge, there's a little town called Hyder, Alaska. There's a road to it from Stewart, but then that's the end of the road. And from there, it's just ocean. Then we continued north on the Cassiar Highway. Now we're at the Kanaskan Lake Provincial Park, and I had never seen harlequin ducks before. These two ducks went swimming by and they were just beautiful. And so I got a picture of a couple male harlequin ducks floating out on this lake. And you can see we got a beautiful campsite here right on the lake. And then the next day, we finally made it up to the Yukon. So we made it through British Columbia. And the Cassiar Highway was kind of an introduction to driving in Canada and Alaska. And it takes a lot of concentration. First of all, you're trying to absorb this just amazing scenery. Wherever you go, the scenery is just unbelievable. And then you're trying to stay on what are usually pretty narrow, windy roads with hardly any shoulders and very, very steep side slopes. So you don't want to get off the road very far. You're going to be in the ditch. And then there's lots of potholes and rough spots and road damage that you have to watch out to. A lot of times you can only make 35, 40 miles an hour on these roads. And there's some real tire busting potholes that you have to keep an eye out for. And then at the same time, you're kind of trying to look for wildlife. So it was beautiful driving, but not relaxing. So then the next day we made it up to Whitehorse. And this is our first view of the Yukon River. And this is near the headwaters of the Yukon River. And the Yukon River is already a huge river. And of course, the Yukon, I've got a map next that'll show you the Yukon River. It goes all the way across Alaska. And there you can see, so Whitehorse is where we are in that previous picture. And then you can see the Yukon River goes all the way across Alaska, and we'll cross that a few times. And it's just kind of an amazing river. It's the third longest river in North America, 1,979 miles long. And we're going to be talking about the Klondike Gold Rush. And you'll see, if you see where Whitehorse is and go up the river, you'll see the Klondike River, and that's where the Klondike Gold Rush actually took place. And this is a steam operated paddle wheeler that went from Dawson, that went from Whitehorse up to Dawson City, which is about 470 miles down the Yukon River from Whitehorse. And in the national parks in Canada, they have these red chairs that they put in different places. And so we were enjoying the red chairs there at this area where this Klondike boat was. And this is another view. This is called Miles Canyon. This is where the Yukon River flows through a narrows just before it gets to the city of Whitehorse. And there was a walking bridge there across that river. And the canyon used to be deeper than it is now, but it's partially flooded by a hydropower dam just downstream near Whitehorse. And Whitehorse is named after a very dangerous rapids that was just past this point. It was called Whitehorse, they believe, because the waves in those rapids were so big, they looked like white horses running in the river. And this is where the men who were on the Klondike Gold Rush, they had boats that they would take through these rapids, and they were very dangerous, and they were on their way to Dawson City, which is 450 miles away from here. And so this is one of the places where some of them didn't make it. The next day we visited kind of an interesting museum in Whitehorse called the Beringia Museum. And the Beringia is named after Bering. Vitus Bering was the guy who discovered the Bering Sea. I think in the 1700s is when he was in there. And so this museum is about this amazing area that during the Ice Age was dry because so much water was locked up in ice that it lowered the ocean enough that this tan colored area between Alaska and Russia was open land. And this is where they believe a lot of animals and people eventually crossed into North America. And the museum was very interesting. It showed some of the animals that they found in fossil records and so forth in this area. And there's a giant beaver and of course the woolly mammoth and just a bunch of other amazing critters that use that area. These big saber-toothed cats and camels and horses and sloths. And they think it was kind of a big sort of a cold steppe grassland type environment that these animals were living in at that time. So now we finally made it to our to Alaska. From Whitehorse, we said we headed south down to Skagway, which is right on the coast of Alaska. And when you drive through Alaska, pretty soon you realize that much of Alaska is pretty rugged, uninhabitable country. And most of the cities and towns are on little narrow areas in deep valleys with mountains on both sides. So it's a pretty amazing country. There's lots of ice fields and taiga and tundra and rock like this in Alaska. One of the things we discovered as we drove into Alaska, we didn't have any trouble getting through customs either into Canada or Alaska, is you would see this sign, especially when you were on the passes, and these poles that you see in the picture, those are markers so the snow plows can figure out where the road is in the winter. I think they get something like 24 feet of snow in this pass in the winter, and they would always have this sign that said, "Watch for snow plows approaching in your lane." What they never did, there was never a sign that explained, well, what do you do if you see a snow plow approaching in your lane? So we always kind of curious what that really meant, but apparently the snow plows have the right of way, and I'm not sure where you're supposed to go when they're plowing snow, but we were kind of wondering about that sign. We saw it in a lot of places. So then we were down in Skagway, and again, this is one of those little towns that's nestled in between the mountains and the ocean. You can see the cruise ships there in the harbor. This is a popular area for cruise ships, and this is the place about 7 miles from Skagway is a little what used to be a town called Dyea, Alaska, and this is where the Chilkoot Trail started for the gold rush, which occurred between 1896 and about 1900. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this picture where you see these guys going up and over this mountain in the winter. And these were the guys that were on the gold rush heading for Dawson City and the Klondike River. And I always thought they just went up and over this pass once and then they were on their way. And this was called the Golden Stairway. And these guys would first have to get a ship from the West Coast in California and take the ship up to Skagway. And then they would disembark at Skagway with all their gear and then head inland. And it was actually a 500-mile journey. And the first step was going up and over this what's called the White Pass. And that was about a 33-mile trail. And the Canadians required them to bring in a ton of gear and equipment because once they got inland, there were no resources. And so these guys would have to make the trip up and over this mountain about 40 times to get all their gear up there. And then once they got over the mountain pass, then they came to a lake called Bennett Lake. And there they would spend the spring building makeshift boats. And then once the ice melted, then they rode those boats down a series of lakes into the Yukon River and then down the Yukon River all the way to Dawson City. I never realized quite how much it took for them to get to the gold fields. This map kind of shows the route that they took there, Skagway at the bottom there. And there's now a railway called the White Pass Railway where that trail went. Then they got into a series of lakes in the Yukon River, and you can see where Dawson City is way up there at the top of the picture, and that's where the Klondike River was, and that's where they were headed. And there was two routes. There was the Dyea route that I mentioned, and then this is what they called the White Pass route that they took. And one was a little shorter than the other, but steeper. The other one was longer, but not as steep. And it would take about 3 months to get all their supplies up and over these passes. And finally, the railroad was built in about 1900. So it's just amazing trip that they took. I never realized quite what that was like. And they were telling us that about 3,000 horses died carrying their equipment up and over the mountains because there was no food for the horses. And they would just get their equipment up there and apparently use the horses till they dropped. Seemed kind of cruel, but apparently that's what happened. So here we are in Skagway. They had a play there called The Days of '98. They did a really nice play about a guy by the name of Soapy Smith, who was a con man who sold soap, of all things, in Skagway, but he kind of tried to take over the town, and eventually a posse of the guys from the town shot and killed him. But this was a play kind of about his history, which was pretty interesting. And there's a railroad, this White Pass and Yukon train ride. Just a beautiful ride up to White Pass from Skagway. And if you ever get to Skagway, I'd really strongly encourage you to take this train ride. It was just beautiful, a fun, really fun trip. The only damage we had during the trip happened while we were riding the train, and it got pretty windy, and I hadn't staked down my awning very well. And so when we got back to the trailer, my awning was up on top of the trailer. And so that was the end of my awning for the trip, but it didn't do any real damage. The only other problem we had is that my windshield on the truck was hit 5 times during the trip, so by rocks, and a couple were big circle dents in the windshield. But fortunately, the part of the windshield where I had to look through to drive never got hit, but our windshield did take a beating during the trip. So now we're going to go from Skagway to Haines, which by water is about 15 miles, but by road is about 365 miles. And the ferry didn't come for 3 days, and so we didn't want to wait. So we drove that route. It was just a beautiful, actually just a beautiful drive. So I'm glad we made the drive. We did see a black bear along the road, which you can see here. And so now we're at Haines, which is about 15 miles away, and it was kind of a long, hard drive. So you can see I was taking a bit of a rest here after that drive to Haines. And this the Chilkoot River comes into Haines into Haines. And this is where, if you've probably heard about the area in Alaska where there's a huge number of eagles build up along that river in the fall. The salmon come in there in the fall, and it attracts about 3,500 eagles, and they have overlooks and stuff along the river where you can see all these eagles. They do have a raptor center there. We stopped there and got to see some of the raptors that they have at the raptor center. And so that would be an interesting place to be in the fall. There were eagles there, but nothing like what you'd see in the fall when we were there. And then the next day, we took a boat trip. It was called the Fjord Express, and we went from Haines to Juneau, and this was about a 90-mile trip by water. And we had just a beautiful day, and it was really a fun trip. And so we got to go down along the inside passage and see what that looked like. And it was about a 3-hour trip by water, and then we had about 3 hours in Juneau, and then a return trip. So it was a long day, but it was really something. And along the way, you see all these glaciers that are coming down into the to the ocean there, and there'd be these incredible waterfalls coming off of below the glaciers, dropping down into the ocean. And all along here, now we're in Southeast Alaska, where this is that big timber kind of country. This is a kind of a temperate, what they call a temperate rainforest, and just huge big trees in this country as well, growing along that temperate rainforest. And we got to see some seals resting here on this buoy, and we got to see some sea lion. There was a big colony, and this was a big buoy that was in the sea lion. And then there was a big flock of surf scoters there floating out in the water that we got to look at. And we also saw all over Alaska, when you get down by the coast, are these fishing boats, and these guys are fishing salmon, and they have these big long nets that they have a boat that helps them, that stretches this net out in a big circle and brings it back to the bigger boat, and then they pull in that net, and then they get a pile of fish. And you can see the salmon here on the side of the boat, just about ready to be pulled into that boat. And we saw a lot of that while we were in Alaska. Amazing the productivity of those waters, even though the salmon runs aren't what they used to be in many places. This is what downtown Juneau looks like. And of course, this is the capital of Alaska. There's no road to Juneau. You either have to take a boat or fly in. It's kind of a pretty city tucked in next to the mountains here. And it's got a population of about 32,000. And there's cruise ships that come in here all the time. And the city itself was actually built on gold mine tailings to create the flat area at the base of these mountains where the city was built. And we had lunch that day in the Red Dog Saloon. And then we were able to catch a bus tour that took us up to what's called the Mendenhall Glacier. And there's a National Park Service visitor center there. And so we got a really good look at this glacier. And then we took a walk through the rainforest on a trail there in Haines. And this forest has a lot of what's called western hemlock and Sitka spruce, just huge trees. And this is probably not nearly as big as they get in some areas, but it was some pretty impressive forest. And this yellow stuff that you see at the base of the trunk of this tree, that's slime mold. And slime mold kind of moves along. And so the area to the left side of the base of that tree is where the slime mold was probably the day before. And now it's moved over here to the right side. And kind of an interesting organism that usually grows on some kind of woody material. The other thing that I found that was kind of interesting is the timber industry in Alaska is pretty well focused on these coastal rainforests. That's where the big wood is. And so that was the only place where we saw much for timber harvesting or, logging trucks and so forth. Once you get to the interior, they're so far away from any markets and the timber is relatively small that there was little to no timber industry that I could see in the interior of Alaska. It all seemed to be located pretty much along the coast. From here, we headed to a national park in Yukon Territory. So we're heading back up north, back into Yukon before we get to the main part of Alaska. And this is really kind of a neat park. And it's a huge park. And it's one of the sites that we saw there was what's called a rock glacier. I'd never seen a rock glacier before, and apparently there's still some ice left underneath all this rock, but the glacier itself has stopped moving, and so the rock is settling down on top of the ice, and it kind of settles down in a wavy kind of a fashion on top of the glacier. And in the distance there, you see this huge lake. And according to our milepost book, it said this lake is full of big northerns and several other kinds of fish. And like most lakes we saw in Northwest Canada and Alaska, there's almost never anybody on them fishing. Everybody seems to be focused on the coastal fishing and on the rivers. And I was surprised at how little fishing I saw in the lakes in Alaska. And this Kluane National Park is actually part of one of the largest international protected areas in the world. So this park is adjacent to the Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska, another park and wilderness area in British Columbia, and then Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. And it contains actually 17 of the 20 tallest peaks in Canada, including Mount Logan, which is the highest peak, the second highest peak in North America. And much of it is just a huge ice field. And we took a trail later in the day called Spruce Beetle Trail. And one of the things we found in Alaska in the interior and in Canada is that these spruce beetles are doing a lot of damage to their forests. And this is kind of just a natural cycle in the Alaskan interior forest. And as they get older, the spruce beetles come in and pretty well kill the trees. So if it isn't burned by fire, the spruce beetles will recycle the forest. So kind of an interesting cycle that they have there. And this is a map that just shows Kluane National Park is the one that's in the corner of the Yukon here, and then the other 3 parks are on both sides of it. So that shows that huge natural area there along the Gulf of Alaska. So now we made it up to Talk, Alaska, and we're finally in Alaska. And there's just beautiful mountains wherever you go, and we're now starting to see some of the taiga type countryside. We did get stopped here on our drive this day as we were going from Kewaunee to Talk. There was a car accident. A truck and a car had a head-on collision, and there's no alternative route. So when there's an accident like that, everything just stops until they get the accident cleared away, and it takes quite a while for help to get there. So we were sitting there for over an hour waiting for that accident to be cleared off. So we're now in the taiga, which is sometimes called the land of little sticks, where it looks much like the black spruce forests in northern Minnesota, like up around Toivola Meadowlands. If you know what that country looks like. Much of the interior of Alaska looks a lot like that. There's lots of these little bog lakes and endless miles of this taiga forest. And these are the mountains in the Wrangell St. Elias National Park Preserve. We're on our way into Alaska now. And this just shows again the snow depth poles when you get up in the passes. This is another glacier called the Worthington Glacier. And we're now heading on what's called the Richardson Highway down to Valdez, Alaska. And there was a big canyon just before you get to Valdez and some beautiful falls there as you're getting into Valdez. Valdez was one of my favorite spots in Alaska. If you get to Alaska, I really encourage you to take a trip to Valdez. This was our campground, and it happened to be my birthday when we were there. So we're having steak and potato salad and beans to celebrate my 73rd birthday. The good thing about having your birthday in the middle of the summer, I've celebrated my birthday in a lot of interesting places. So this is one of the most interesting. Now, Carol and I made sure to have our bear spray and our bear bells when we went hiking, but we were in Valdez and there was this little trail called the Dock Point Trail, and we were right next to town. And so we thought, well, we don't need our bear spray for this trail. Good grief, we're right next to town. But when we got to the head of the trail, there was a sign there that said, "Bears in the area do not enter, stay on marked trail." Kind of a confusing sign, but we headed down the trail, and it was about a mile-long trail, and we were just about done with the trail. We come around a corner, and here's this black bear coming towards us. And he was a friendly bear. He didn't bother us, but we turned around and decided to go the other way. We decided it was his trail. So that was one of our first close encounters with a bear in Alaska. Along this trail, we got to see these oyster catchers, black oyster catchers feeding in the mud there. They're really beautiful. And some big, huge skunk cabbage. Everything in Alaska is giant sized. And then there's a kind of a fungus ground cone, it's called, that we saw along the trail there. And of course, Valdez is where the Exxon Valdez oil spill occurred in 1989. They had an interesting museum in Valdez. The gold rush, they were also impacted by the gold rush in 1898. And then the big earthquake that occurred in Alaska basically destroyed most of Valdez by it was really a tsunami that hit Valdez, and so they moved the town to higher ground after that earthquake. And one of the things we saw in the museum that we thought was really interesting is this is a native raincoat made with seal and bear intestines that they would sew together. Very light and waterproof, and kind of interesting how ingenious they were in figuring out how to deal with the rain, which is quite common in this country. And here it shows a bunch of fishermen again out with their tender boats, putting out the nets. And you can see this big pile on that boat. You can see how low that boat is in the water. That pile is all salmon. And so they were catching incredible numbers of salmon in this harbor here. And this was the first place where we got to see a grizzly bear. This bear was just feeding like a cow on this green vegetation along this ditch along the road, and I wasn't paying much attention to the rest of us. But and that's not actually, we're not actually very far from where that trail was that we were hiking, where we saw the black bear. And the you think of these big predators as eating a lot of meat, but actually 80% of the diet of these grizzly bears in Alaska is vegetation. They're always hunting and looking for vegetation. The next day we took what turned out to be one of our favorite trips on the trip, and this was an all-day excursion on a boat called the Lulabelle. And this is the Lulabelle, and we're lined up here getting ready to board the boat. And this was again, we had a beautiful day for this, and the trip was out to a huge glacier called the Columbia Glacier. And this is just some of the views again that we saw as we were heading out. And the guy that ran the boat was named Captain Fred, and he had lived here all his life, and he really knew the history of the area, and really interesting. He was kind of giving a play-by-play action all day long on this trip. And I think he was probably about 75 years old, and yet he was still doing these excursions. You can tell he just really loved and was excited about telling other people about Alaska. And on the way, again, we got to see some more sea lions. And this was the first time, and actually the only time, that we got to see sea otters. And boy, are they fun critters to see. And they're very playful, just like you see them, and they're cute because they're laying on their backs, floating like corks in the water. And we did see a few humpback whales. We didn't see any breach out of the water, but they would come up and then dive down, and you get a good look at their tails as they dove down. And we got to see some puffins along the cliffs on this boat ride, and this is called a black guillemot, another water bird that's pretty common in the ocean. And there was this black bear going across this glacier that we got to look at. So you never know what you're going to see on these trips, but there was a lot of fun stuff to see. These are harbor seals, and now we're coming up to the Columbia Glacier. And as we got closer to the glacier, there was more and more of these icebergs in the water. And normally he tries to bring his boat right up to the face of the glacier, but if there's too much ice like this, then he can't get much closer than this. But this is an example of how huge these glaciers and ice fields are in Alaska. And this next picture is an aerial view. This, of course, we didn't take, but we got this picture. And you can see the boat there, and here he is right up next to the Columbia Glacier. And this is what's called the second largest tidewater glacier in North America. And this is emptying into the Prince William Sound. The tidewater glaciers are glaciers that actually come down to the ocean. And the main way that they don't melt so much as the ice just breaks off as it gets into the water. And so this is where you get the calving, where the ice breaks off from the glaciers and goes down in the water. And as we got closer to here, it was surprising how cold it got. You're surrounded by all this ice. And so it was a pretty interesting spot, but he couldn't get close enough to that glacier. So there was another one nearby that he was able to get right up next to. So we got to see some calving occur on this part of the glacier here. And then they took pictures of everybody in the front of the boat, kind of a Titanic type picture there that everybody got to take. And the sound of those glaciers, you would be listening, and he sat there for about an hour and let us watch. And all of a sudden you'd hear a crack just like a gunshot. And then a big, huge chunk of ice would fall off into the ocean. I wasn't able to be fast enough to get any pictures of the ice as it actually fell off, but it was pretty impressive to see and to hear. And now we're driving, now we're heading up towards Anchorage in Alaska. And here again is another glacier. This is what's called a valley glacier. And this glacier is actually 27 miles long by 4 miles wide. And it comes way down into the valley below the ice field above it. And this area is very popular with hikers. And we camped that night at a place called King Mountain, right on this Mantuska River. So the next day we made it to Palmer, Alaska. And one of the things that Carol wanted to see was the muskox farm. And so they have a muskox farm there where they raise muskox, and they gave us a little tour. They've got a kind of a visitor center there, and then they give tours to look at the muskox, and really interesting critters. And we found out that they're not very easy to domesticate. And these guys have figured out, they've got about 79 muskox here, and they've figured out how to get them to mate and reproduce. But this year they only got one calf, and that's this little guy down here at the bottom of the picture. That's Bumblebee. I thought that was a pretty cute name for a little muskox. And the one thing I was surprised, they're not as big as you think they are. They only stand about 4 feet or so tall at the shoulders. And so it's pretty amazing the way they can defend themselves against wolves by forming a circle there. You know, I always envisioned them as being bigger critters than they are. So pretty cool animals. And they sell muskox wool there. That's the downy soft underwool. And of course the muskox have that real long hair on the outer side, and then the downy underwool, and that's shed each spring. And it's supposed to be 8 times warmer than wool. It's extraordinarily lightweight. And they had it for sale there, and it was only $95 per 1 ounce skein. And so we didn't buy any of the muskox wool, but it would make a pretty nice sweater if you could afford to make it. So next, we made it to Anchorage, and we're heading now down into the Kenai Peninsula. And we had planned on spending some time in Anchorage, but when we got there, the only campground we could find was right downtown, kind of in the middle of an industrial area, and it didn't look too inviting. Then there was another campground on the edge of town. We went out there, and it turns out they had turned that into a homeless shelter for campers, and so there was no public camping there. So we decided to skip Anchorage, and we just drove right through Anchorage and down into the Kenai Peninsula. And so this is a map that shows the Kenai Peninsula. You can see where Anchorage is there, and the road then follows right along the north side of what's called Turnagain Arm, and it's a long, narrow arm off of Cook Inlet. And during the tides, when the tides come in, they're concentrated as they go in this narrow arm, and it creates what they call bore tides. And when conditions are right, the tide is so strong and large that people can actually surf on the tide. And here's a picture. We didn't take this picture, but here's a picture showing people surfing on the tide. And so it's pretty unusual tide in that Turnagain Arm. And this is what it looks like. And so at low tide, you can see it's mostly just a big mud area, and there's kind of these streams that go out into this Turnagain Arm. And then you come back an hour or so later, and the thing is completely flooded, as you see on the right side picture here. And then we went. Oh, it's called Turnagain Arm because when Captain Cook came into this, he was exploring this area in I think it was 1778. And he was looking for the Northwest Passage, and he came into Turnagain Arm, and of course it turned out it wasn't the Northwest Passage, so he had to turn again and go another way. So that's how that got named. So the next day we took a trip to a little town that's right on the coast, and to get there you have to go through this 2.5 mile long tunnel that goes right through the mountain. And this is the entrance to the tunnel, and it's just a 1-lane tunnel, and there's also a railroad track that goes through the middle of it, and about every half hour they let one side or the other side go. And so when the light turns green, you get to go through this tunnel, and this is what it looks like inside of that tunnel. And then you come out on the other side to a little town called Whittier, Alaska, right on the, again, we're right on the coast. And like all these towns, they have these huge marinas. And one thing about Alaska, they have more interesting different kinds of boats. I've never seen so many kinds of boats as they have in Alaska. It's just amazing, all the different boats and boat traffic. And of course, that's the main way they get around in Alaska. Near there was wildlife, what's called the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center. And this is dedicated to preserving Alaska's wildlife, and it's kind of an educational center. And then they have all these different animals there, kind of in natural habitats. You can walk around, and here you can see black bears, on the left side of this bridge, and there's some brown bears on the right side, and they had caribou and moose and all different kinds of animals here. So it's kind of fun place. And they had this display here, which just shows the relative size of black bear versus a brown bear versus a polar bear. Then in the middle is my wife. And it was cold that day, yeah. And it was always pretty cool in Alaska. I would say the temperatures were normally in the 50s and 60s. We maybe had a few days that got up to 70, but it's relatively cool climate. And we were fortunate. We didn't have much rain. You can run into a lot of rain. We had some rainy days, especially when we were camped in this area, but it wasn't bad. The next day it was raining, and so we decided to take a side trip down to Seward. It says Seward here, but it's supposed to be Seward, Alaska. And there's a big marine museum there. So we spent the day visiting that marine museum. It's really a cool museum with all different kinds of marine characters. And then nearby is Kenai Fjords National Park. And we took a hike up to this Exit Glacier, it's called. And this is northwest of Seward, maybe 15 miles away. And we took this trail that goes up to the glacier. And like a lot of the glaciers, even in Alaska, a lot of them have been receding for some time. And so they have these signs along the route into the glacier showing where it was. And one of the first signs was 1951. And where the glacier was in 1951, which is about the time we were born. I was born in 49, Carol in 50. And now that area is actually reverted to big forest. It was big aspen and other trees in that area. So the glacier has retreated at least a mile from this point back to where you see it in the picture on the left. And you can see where even in 2005, you're still quite a ways away from where the glacier is today. So a lot of these glaciers in Alaska are receding. And you could see it's kind of fun when you walk up to these glaciers, you can see some of the same features we see right here in Minnesota. And you can see the scratch marks from the glacier on this rock here. And then these glacial erratics are these big, huge boulders that get dropped by the glacier. And of course, we see the same thing around here where we're living. So now we finally made it to the Kenai Peninsula, a famous part of Alaska. And once we headed south from Anchorage, that was the only part of Alaska where there was actually quite a bit of traffic and it was pretty busy. And we got about halfway down the Kenai Peninsula. We were looking for a campground, and actually we found the Izaak Walton League campground here. It's right on the Kenai River, a famous trout fishing, salmon fishing river. But it was kind of an old campground. The campsites were pretty small and narrow, so we ended up not camping there. There was another more modern provincial park or Alaska State Park campground not too far away. Bing's Landing, it's called, which was also on the Kenai River. So that's where we ended up staying there. And we're right next to the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. So we took a hike around the refuge, and you can see what the interior of Alaska looks like here. Lots of black spruce, pretty simple forests, black spruce, aspen, some birch, and that's about it for trees. There's not a lot of diversity. But beautiful. And one of the things that we found interesting is that there seemed to be an incredible amount of berry production in their bog areas compared to what we're used to. And I don't know if it's because of all the sunlight or different soils or what, but there was just berries all over the place. Part of the reason why there's maybe so many bears in Alaska, but they're very productive. It'd been raining for several days, so I'm kind of celebrating here that the sun is finally out again. And this is a state recreation called Captain Cook State Recreation that we drove to, and there's a volcano there that you can see in the distance called Mount Redoubt. And this is what's called Captain Cook Inlet out here in front of it. And so the next day we finally made it to Homer, Alaska. So now we're all the way down to the south end of the Kenai Peninsula. And it turns out it's also a great place to raise peonies. In fact, all the plants around here just seem to grow giant size. You can see everywhere we went in Alaska, there was fireweed You can see the fireweed in the background here, and that stuff was about head high. Just amazing that, you know, because of the long daylight, stuff really grows, and they can grow cabbage like crazy. I'd hoped to go halibut fishing in Homer, but it turned out that everything was booked up for about 10 days ahead, so there was no way that we were going to get in to go halibut fishing, so I wasn't able to do that. And this is just some views from our campground. This was a KOA campground that we were in there. It sits up on this ridge, and some of the campgrounds are kind of like basically a gravel parking lot, not too fancy, but the view was incredible. This picture on the left is the view out in front of that campground. But it was nice to have drinking water that we could drink, hot showers, and laundry once in a while. So we would try to hit a commercial campground, you know, maybe once a week or so, just to get freshened up a bit. This again, just they had a little overlook there down over, we're looking over right by Homer, and this is the Cook Inlet, and this just shows the profuse, especially coal crops, cabbage and so forth, that they grow in this country. Pretty interesting. And when we were in Homer, just to give you an idea of the length of the days, we were there on, it's now July 20th, so we're a month into our trip. And the sunrise was at about 5:15 a.m. and sunset was about 11 p.m. And boy, we really enjoyed the long days. You kind of lose track of time. And even at night, it doesn't really get dark. It gets darker, but not really dark. So pretty neat that way. This is a view of Homer, and there's a long spit in Homer, and that's this long string of land that you can see here that goes way out into the ocean. And there's a road that goes down the middle of that, and there's a bunch of businesses and so forth along that road. But this is the view up above Homer. And again, this just shows you the really lush growth. Everything just grows like crazy. There was a little nature center there, and we took a hike on a trail at the nature center. And then now we're down on that Homer spit, and it's just a long gravel spit that goes out into the ocean. And here you can see at the bottom photo, just there's a bunch of different businesses and stuff, mostly tourist type businesses along this Homer spit, as well as a lot of fishing outfits that'll take you out trout or salmon or halibut fishing, but they were all full when we got there. So instead of going fishing, we went to Captain Patty's here, and we had baked halibut in dill sauce, it was called, and boy was it good. I just love halibut, and so it was a lot cheaper actually getting my halibut at the Captain Patty's than if I'd actually gone out fishing. But it would have been fun to have done that. But next time I go to Alaska, I'll make sure and get that scheduled ahead of time. But it's hard to do on a trip like this because you never know for sure when you're going to get where you're headed when you're just driving along the way we were. So we had to just kind of take things as we found them. We didn't try to schedule stuff ahead of time. One thing we wanted to show you, we stopped at the Safeway here in Homer. And, you know, we've been putting up tree cages in Duluth to protect the trees from the deer. Well, in Homer, they put up tree cages to protect the trees from moose. And this tree cage is 10 feet tall. And so they use tree cages, but they have to be a lot bigger than what we're used to. So I thought that was kind of interesting. On our way back, now we're heading back north on the Kenai Peninsula. We stopped at a little place called Anchor Point, and this is the westernmost drivable road in North America. This is the westernmost you can get on a drivable highway. And so we took a picture there. And this shows, this is called a tractor. There was right by this point, there was a tractor boat launch. It's kind of interesting. Essentially, it's a skidder, a big skidder, and these guys drive up with their big fishing boats on a big trailer. They hook it up to this skidder, and he just backs them out into the ocean, and the trailer is completely underwater. And then they fire up their engines and back off the trailer, and then you can see down below off they go to go fishing out in Cook Inlet. So I'd never seen a tractor boat launch before. That was kind of interesting. And this is just a view of one of the volcanic mountains there across Cook Inlet. And the fishermen were cleaning their fish there, their salmon, and then throwing the guts on the shoreline. And there were several eagles there grabbing those fish amongst a bunch of gulls. And these are what's called glaucous wing gulls. They're fairly common along the coast in Alaska, but there's several different species of gulls here along with the eagles. One thing we noticed in Alaska is if you look at this picture, most of what you see in this picture has been burned over. And we went through many humongous burn areas like this. This is what's called the Swan Lake fire. This occurred in 2019, kind of right in the middle of the Kenai Peninsula. But almost every day we would drive through huge burn areas, and they don't try to put these fires out. They actually ecologically they're good for the land. They kind of recycle the forest and create good habitat for moose and caribou and bears and so forth. But they just basically just protect the settlements and let everything else burn. And there's so much wild country there, they can get away with that. But we ran into to many of those situations. So now we're at the Russian River campground along the Russian River, and we were camped nearby. We weren't camped in this campground because it was full, because there's lots of trout fishermen here. And this Russian River is a famous salmon fishing area, and it dumps into the Kenai River, and they have this boardwalk that goes along the river. And then this was highly eroded apparently from all the fishermen traffic in the past, and so they built this boardwalk, and then they have little steps every so often where the fishermen can get down into the river, and that's where I'm standing here next to one of these steps. And this is Forest Service land here, and it was kind of interesting. There was these huge black cottonwoods, which are a different variety of poplar, but similar to our cottonwoods and Balmagilead trees. And there were several kind of leaning trees, and they were broken off maybe 10 feet above the ground, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. Finally, we came to a sign, and it turns out that they didn't want these trees to fall on the boardwalk or also tip over and cause erosion along the creek. So the Forest Service had guys climb up about 10 feet into the trees, and then they dynamited off the tops. I thought it was kind of an extreme way to solve a problem, but the trees actually survived and were resprouting. But I guess that's how they do it in Alaska. I was kind of surprised to hear that. And then you see these signs all over when you get down by the salmon fishing streams. And of course, they're warning the fishermen about bears, and the bears are attracted to these rivers because of all the salmon. And so there's some precautions they're supposed to follow. They're supposed to keep their pack within 3 feet of them all the time, and they can have a stringer that they carry with them, but it can be on a rope that's no longer than 12 feet. So they want that pretty close to the fishermen. And the reason for that is if they see a bear coming out, they don't want the bears to associate the fishermen with fish. And so if you see a bear coming, you're supposed to cut your line if you got a fish on it, so the bear doesn't recognize that you're the reason the fish is there. And the same thing, if he's coming for your stringer, you're supposed to cut your stringer and let the bear have it. So the bears kind of have right away on the river, and they're not supposed to shoot the bears. They encourage them to carry bear spray if they have a bear that's getting too close, and they are allowed to shoot it if it's actually physically threatening somebody. And then the other interesting thing is this is where the Russian River joins the Kenai River, and out in the middle of the river were two metal cleaning tables. And you can see this guy coming, he's got a couple of salmon there. And so they're supposed to clean their fish out in the river, and then they dump the guts and stuff. There's kind of a chute here right into the river. So the gulls and things clean that up, or if it gets downstream, a bear might find it. But the idea is, again, to get that waste away from the fishermen and let the wildlife recycle it. I thought that was kind of an interesting approach to solve that problem. And we happened to be here kind of in between the salmon runs, so they weren't catching a lot of fish, but obviously there were a few that were catching fish that we got to see. And along the trail there, we got to see this merganser that had a young, one of its young redding on its back. That was kind of fun to see. And this is a spruce grouse. We saw several spruce grouse as we're hiking these trails. And this is one of those big black cottonwoods, they call them, that was along the trail that I got my hands on. And I can't remember the name of this flower, but just kind of a beautiful flower. And we're on a trail now. Carol wanted to see salmon jumping up the falls in a river. And while we were hiking that trail along the river, we ran into a conservation officer, and Carol asked him, where can I go to see salmon? And he told us about this trail. It's about a 2.5 mile hike in and out, 5 miles total. And so we hiked back in there, and when you get to the end of the trail, you come to this big falls on the Russian River. And sure enough, there were huge numbers of salmon piled up at the base of this falls here, and then you would see them jumping up, trying to get up river. And boy, it's a pretty tough. This picture doesn't do it justice, but there's some pretty big falls here that they're trying to get up and over. But you could see them shooting up into the stream and making their way slow but surely upstream. But most of the time they would try, and you'd see them wash back down, and then they'd try again. And then they do have a fish ladder here, and I think the game and fish people in Alaska use that when they want to take either sample the fish or maybe get spawn from them for eggs and so forth. And here we're just on what's called the Seward Highway in the Kenai Peninsula. Just give you an idea what that country looks like. It's just beautiful, beautiful country. Lots of big mountains and valleys. And we're now heading our way north towards Anchorage and towards Denali National Park. And you can see again the fireweed, which is just everywhere in Alaska. And we made camp at a little campground north of Palmer. And there was a side road here called Hatcher Pass. So before going up to Denali, we decided to take this Hatcher Pass. It's about a 50-mile drive on this road that goes up above the tree line. And it's really one of these steep, windy roads that kind of gets your heart going in places, because there's a long ways down to the bottom. So your hands are sweating and your heart is beating, but the scenery was just incredible. And one of the fun things that we saw there, we're now at the top of the pass, and the elevation you notice here is just 3,800 feet. And so the tree line in Alaska is not that high because it's such a cold climate. You don't have to get that high up, and so far north, you don't have to get that high up before you get in above the tree line. And then there was a mountain up there, or a big rock, I guess you'd call it. And this was called Nixon's Nose. And it kind of looks pretty much like Richard Nixon there. So it's kind of an interesting spot. And this is just some more views up at Hatcher Pass. Now the next day we're on our way up towards Denali National Park. We got up early in the morning, about 5 o'clock. The sky was clear, the sun was shining, and we got on the road by about 7:30, and we thought for sure we were going to see Denali, but as we were heading north, it got cloudier and cloudier and rainier. And so this is not Denali in the distance here, but these are some mountains that we saw along the way. And of course, we weren't going to be able to see Denali either because of the rain. So we didn't have any big view of the mountain, or view of the big mountain that day. And we stopped at a RV park about 30 miles from, or 15 miles from, or it was about 30 miles, I guess, from the entrance into Denali. So we set up camp, and we were ready the next day, or even that afternoon. Actually, we had enough time to drive up and into Denali National Park. So this is the entrance to Denali. And we made reservations for the next day to take the bus trip on the road that goes into Denali National Park. And you can't drive, you can drive the first 15 miles on that road, and then you have to take buses beyond that point. And so here we are the next day, we're loading up for this bus trip into Denali National Park. We still haven't seen the mountain itself. But along the way, we get to see just beautiful country and the Denali National Park. And a lot of it is kind of above tree line or just small trees like this and these vast big views. And we did get to see some pretty good wildlife along the way. There's caribou. We saw several caribou, and they were all kind of at a distance, but we got a pretty good look at them. This is a grizzly bear that was feeding along the side of the road that we could see. And here we are, everybody's looking out there. We know Denali is out there somewhere, but we can't see it. But again, we have lots of fireweed along the roads. And there I'm pointing, the guy that led the tour, he says, yeah, Denali is out there, you just can't see it. So I'm pointing towards Denali, but we haven't seen it yet. And this is one of the rivers. This is kind of as far into the park as you can get now. It crosses this river and then you can't go beyond that. And I put this picture in here just because most of the rivers in Alaska look like this, or a large number of them. And basically these are glacier fed streams. And so they carry lots of sand and gravel from the glaciers. And you end up with these braided, and the water in these things is really moving. You can't tell in this picture, but the current in these things is just amazing. And it causes all this gravel and stuff to kind of sort and resort. And so you get these big braided, wide valleys and braided streams with an incredible amount of water going through them. And that water is real silty looking because of all the silt and sand and gravel from the glaciers. That was very common in Alaska. And the next morning we got up and the sky was clear. And so we made some coffee, jumped in our truck and headed down the road. It was about 5:30 in the morning, and we got down the road a ways, and sure enough, there was Denali. So we had a good clear view of Denali, and we took
75 miles away.
we took about 100 pictures of the mountain, and the mountain itself is actually about 70 miles away at this point, but it just jumps right up out of the ground. It's really impressive to see. And this was maybe our favorite picture of Denali. There was this wetland here with some trumpeter swans in it, and then in the background is the mountain itself. And again, here you can see this spruce beetle damage to the spruce is very common to see in Alaska, and that's why all these trees are dead in the foreground. That's just kind of a close-up picture of Denali. So we did get a really good look at Denali, and we went back into the park that day, and we were able to see it within the park as well. Here we are in the park itself, and it's starting to get a little cloudy around it, but you could still see Denali really well. So we really appreciated being able to see the mountain. And apparently about once every 4 days, on average, you get a chance to see the mountain. So we were fortunate to be able to see Denali. This is just a little trail that we took up at the end of the road, walked around and saw the country there a little bit. A lot of flowers, and there was some permafrost here, so we got to see an up close look at what permafrost looks like, and just kind of a muddy mess, but that's permafrost. There was a cabin, there's a series of cabins along this road that goes into the park, and the road goes into the park about 80 miles, but we could only get in about 35 miles. And these cabins were built by the guys that built the road, but they're still used by the Park Service in the winter, and they use dog sleds to go into the park and check on things and so forth. And then they stay in these cabins, which I thought was kind of interesting. So this cabin is about 100 years old. It was built in around the 1920s, and they have nails on the shutters over the windows here to keep the bears from getting into the cabins. This was called the Savage Cabin. There was a little trail there that gave some interpretation. So from here, we left Denali now, and we're heading north up to Fairbanks. And we made it to Fairbanks, and we camped right in the town of Fairbanks. And so this is the first time we got really a good look at the Alaska pipeline. And of course, this starts in Valdez. When you're down in Valdez, you really don't see the pipeline, and down there it's mostly buried in the ground. And the only place where they have the pipeline elevated like we see here is where there's permafrost. And the pipeline is about 48 inches in diameter. It's about an 800-mile route from Valdez to Prudhoe Bay on the north end. It crosses about 300 or 3 mountain ranges and 500 rivers and streams. And it's insulated to keep the oil from getting too cool. If the oil cools off too much, it coagulates and would actually plug up in the pipe. And so it's insulated to keep the oil warm as it goes through that pipe. And it's high enough, you can see one of the things they talk about is how the caribou can get under the pipe. I used to think that they made it high enough so that wildlife could migrate under the pipe, but it doesn't really have anything to do with that. It's to keep it out of the permafrost, because it would melt the permafrost and you'd end up with a problem if you tried to have the pipe in the permafrost. And this is called a pig. This is an example of the gizmo that they run through the pipe periodically to keep the pipe clean and open. Not exactly sure how that thing is powered, but they run those through the pipeline. And then one of the things we did in Fairbanks, if you get to Fairbanks, this is called the Riverboat Discovery, and it was a 4-hour tour down the what's called the Chena River. And this boat is big enough, it holds about 700 people, and it was almost full the day that we went on it. We were able to get a reservation, and they go down the river and they give you an interpretation of the history of the area, and they have a float plane come and land and take off next to the boat to show you how that works. And then we got to what's called the Trail Breaker Kennel, and they stopped along this kennel, and this place was actually founded by Susan Butcher, and she was a 4-time Iditarod champion. No man has won the Iditarod 4 times, but Susan Butcher did. And she developed kind of a dog-friendly way of training dogs that was very successful. And this is an example. They've got these puppies, and they create these obstacle courses, and they have the puppies run up and over the logs and so forth to learn how to overcome obstacles. And they were just talking about the way they train their dogs, and really interesting. And then they gave us a demonstration. They had this 4-wheeler, and then they had a dog team, and I think that thing was going about 20 miles an hour. It's amazing how those dogs could pull that 4-wheeler, and there's a big track that goes all the way around the kennels here, and you can see the kennels in the background. And then the last stop on our trip was a kind of a recreated Chena Indian village. And at the entrance of the village in the water here is a fish wheel. And these are gizmos that are powered by the current. And as they go around, they'll catch the salmon that are coming upriver. And then there's the salmon fall into a chute, and then from there down into a box. And so that's an easy way for the natives to catch salmon. And they had a guy here that gave us a demonstration of how they clean and dry their salmon. And these, the salmon that were running while we were there are called dog salmon. And it turns out they're called dog salmon because they're not the choicest salmon to eat. They like to eat the sockeye salmon. And so these are the salmon that they dry and feed to their sled dogs. And so that's why they're called dog salmon. And they showed us, some of the shelters that the Chena Indians would use when they were traveling, and the kind of boats they would use and so forth. And then they had this demonstration of the clothes that they wear, and they had this native girl was dressed up in this fur coat that was just incredible. And they said this was kind of a dress uniform that they would wear, but it was really beautiful. And here's a food fur cache. We see these are still used in Alaska, where they store furs and food off the ground to keep the bears and other critters, especially the wolverines, I guess, were a big problem back in the day. And so they would use these to store their food. And this is a conch from a tree, and they would use that. They would drill a hole in that, and they would put embers in there, and that's how they carried their fire from one campsite to another. Never heard of that before, so that was pretty interesting. And it's just kind of an example of a trapper's cabin that was there. And this is the Chena River, and the Chena River is a clear river, and it flows into the Tanana River, which is a glacier river. And you can see here where the two meet. So the clear water is from the Chena River, and then the the Tanana River is a glacier stream, and you can see how much silt and sediment is in that. So that's natural, but that's just how silty these rivers are that are downstream from the glaciers. So now we're north. We're going to take a trip north of Fairbanks. This is kind of our last big adventure in Alaska. And this is called the Dalton Highway. And this highway goes, follows the pipeline all the way up to Prudhoe Bay. So it's about a 600-mile road, all gravel. And we were going to take about the first 200 miles up to the Arctic Circle. And so when we got up in the morning, it was raining, and we were kind of hemming and hawing. Should we try to drive that in the rain? And the forecast looked like it was supposed to stop. So we decided to take off, and so we left about 8 in the morning. And you drive about, I think it was about 70 miles up a real windy paved road until you get to the Dalton Highway. And so this is where you actually start on the gravel part of the road. And so now we're heading north towards the Arctic Circle, and it's just this endless rolling country that seems to go on forever. And there's one gas station shortly after we got on the blacktop, and then the next gas station is about 125 miles away. So there's not a lot of civilization along this road. There's a lot of road damage on the tar part of the road. It was pretty slow going, and then actually the gravel road was almost better than the paved road. And so this just kind of gives you some idea what that looks like. Again, here's another big burn area beyond the stream here. These just go on forever. And this was called the Hess Creek fire, and this burned 117,000 acres. This just kind of gives you an idea what it's like driving on this road. There's no shoulders, and you got to be careful, because if you get too far off to the side, they're pretty soft. And then you can see if you go over the side, the road is elevated about 15 feet above the ground because of the permafrost. And if you go off that edge, you're going to probably roll over. So it's kind of, again, you got to pay attention when you're driving. And then this is really an industrial road. In fact, it was closed to the public for a few years, and then they did open it to the public. But there's a lot of big truck traffic on this road, oil trucks and trucks hauling all kinds of different equipment. And so you keep an eye out, and you see a truck coming, or if you see one in your rearview mirror, you just pull over to the side of the road and let them go by, because they're making time and they don't want to slow down for you if they can help it. And so you try to give them the right of way. And here's another spot where we could see the pipeline. We stopped to take a look, and there was the hen grouse over here on the left side of the road, and she was calling away, and the chicks, you could hear the chicks calling in the brush. So I ran down there with my camera, and pretty soon I could see the chicks coming across the road. And so I was trying to get a picture of that hen with her chicks, and Carol laughed, because while I was trying to take a picture of those grouse, another chick was walking right behind me and went up and joined the rest of the grouse on the other side. So this now again, we're at the Yukon River, and this is a bridge, a half-mile long bridge at this point that goes over the Yukon River. And just before we got here, we came up, there's a long hill that goes down to the Yukon River. And just before we got here, all of a sudden there was a guy in a truck with flashing lights, kind of like you see for wide loads. And he asked us to pull over. He said, "We got a big load coming. We've got a boat from Prudhoe Bay, and it's about 20 feet wide. And we need you to just stay out of the way." So we pulled over on the side. About 15 minutes later, here comes this semi truck with umpty one wheels on it, and this huge boat that they were hauling down to an area north of Anchorage to get repairs on it. It's actually cheaper to haul the boat down this road than it is to float it around all the way around Alaska and up to where they would get the repairs done. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And so we stopped here at the river. That gives you an idea. Now you can see how big the Yukon River is at this point, and it's still only halfway to where it dumps into the ocean. And I can't imagine how big the Yukon River must be when you finally get to the outlet. But it's just a huge river at this point. And this is called the Yukon River Camp. This is kind of typical of Alaskan architecture. It's all utilitarian, nothing very fancy. It's sturdy enough to withstand the river. Not a lot of maintenance or anything as far as yards and that kind of thing. And so we stopped here to get gas. And this is there's rooms here that you can rent, and there's a restaurant here, and they sell gas. And then they also have a repair place if you need tires or something repaired. And this is a gas pump, and you go inside and you leave your credit card at the counter inside the restaurant there. And then she tells you, go out and gas up your truck and then take a picture of the gauge on the pump, which you do. And here you can see I only needed 7 gallons of gas, and it was $50, and the price of gas here was $7.49 a gallon. This was the most I paid for gas, but it was probably the best gas I bought because the trip up here was just spectacular. And so then you go inside and you pay up, and then you get your credit card back. If you don't take a picture of the pump, then she charges you for a full tank of gas, whether or not you got it. So kind of an interesting situation. This is what it looks like in the store. Nice enough inside. We decided to buy some apple pie and ice cream, and I think that was about $7.50 a piece. Nothing is cheap in Alaska. We got some coffee there and some t-shirts celebrating the Arctic Circle. We hadn't made it to the Arctic Circle yet, but we thought we should get some t-shirts. And the lady working here, she actually had a southern accent. She was from Florida, and she comes all the way up here in the middle of nowhere to work in the summer at this Yukon place this place along the Yukon River. So pretty interesting. Now the next gas station from here is about another 120 miles away, so you definitely don't want to pass it if you're going up the Yukon or up the Dalton Highway. And this is just a view. We went across the bridge, and there's a little visitor center there, BLM Visitor Center. And again, you can see the size of that pipeline where you drive under it here. And this is a view of the bridge over the Yukon River. And again, now we're getting up close to the Arctic Circle, and we're getting to the point now where there's very few trees. There's a lot of these these are black spruce trees, but they're maybe 4 feet tall. They're barely growing because it's such a cold climate and so forth up there. And there's a little mountain up there, or a little rock here they call Finger Mountain. Then from Finger Mountain, you can look and see what they call Finger Rock, and you can see that rock sticking up there behind the outhouse. You can see why it's called Finger Rock on Finger Mountain. And there's a little trail there. We hiked around and looked at the vegetation there a little bit. And here we are. We finally made it to the Arctic Circle. We're about 200 miles north of Fairbanks, and we're still only 1/3 of the way, all the way up to the Prudhoe Bay at the far end. So it's a long ways up there, and those guys driving those trucks are going up and down that thing all the time. There's a neat little campground here. There was nobody in the campground. There's a BLM campground here, and if I ever get up to Alaska again, I'm going to pull my trailer up to here and camp, and then make the trip further north to see what it looks like. So that's as far north as we got. We made it to the Arctic Circle. It was something we always wanted to do. And now we're on our way back. And again, you can see the pipeline parallels the road. Sometimes it's fairly close, sometimes it's quite a ways away. And you see how the pipeline is zigzagged. And the reason for that is protected from the permafrost that causes the ground to kind of move around, and also earthquakes. So there's some flexibility in the pipe, so it can give a little bit if there's an earthquake. The other thing we noticed on the culverts along the Dalton Highway, we would see these copper pipes sticking out of the ground. They were painted red or orange on the end. And it turns out these are thaw pipes. And when they need to thaw out the culverts in the spring, they blow steam in these pipes to open up the culverts. Never seen that before. So we made it back. We've been driving now for about 14 and a half hours on this road. It's pretty slow going, and you can see my truck was a little bit worse for the wear, but we didn't have any flat tires or anything. And we're still about 2 hours away from Fairbanks, so we're not done driving yet. And as we were heading back, this is what the road looks like once you get to the tar part of the road. We came around a corner, and sure enough, there was that same truck that we'd seen earlier in the day when they were hauling the boat. And the boat had got, the truck that was hauling the boat had got stuck on a corner. And so we had to sit for another half hour and wait for them to get the boat unstuck so we could get by. So we got to wait for that boat twice in one day. And this is right about sunset now. It's about 10:47 p.m. And we're finally on our way back to Fairbanks. The next day we hiked around Fairbanks, and there's a thing called Creamer's Field. There used to be a big dairy farm operation here, and the people that owned it just happened to be named Creamers. Pretty good name if you're going to run a dairy farm. And once the farm quit, they sold the land, and it was bought by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and now it's a waterfowl refuge in Fairbanks. And here is one place that we saw some wildlife. There was quite a few sandhill cranes and white-fronted geese, as well as some mallards and pintails in this area. There was the next day we kind of relaxed, and we took a trip to a botanical garden in Fairbanks, and they do research there on trying to find varieties of plants that do well with the long sunlight and the cold soil. And they have got some things that really grow. Cabbages and flowers and stuff were really something here. And they had some Juneberries that I'd never seen a Juneberry with so many berries on it. They were about the size of your thumbnail, and the tree was just full of berries. So whatever they're doing there, they know what they're doing. They had some pretty amazing plants. So now we're heading out of Fairbanks, and we're finally now on the way back, leaving Alaska. And this is another one of the big rivers in Alaska. This is the Tanana River, fourth largest river in Alaska. And so it's kind of bittersweet because we're on our way out of Alaska at this point, heading towards the Alaska Highway. But there's still a lot to see. And we stopped, there's a bridge that went over the Tanana River. And you can't tell in this picture, but the current here is just amazing. And I don't know how these guys fish this, but there were a bunch of boats here with boat trailers, and this guy came by in his boat. And so somehow they're fishing this stuff for salmon, but the current is so crazy. I couldn't figure out actually how they do it, but they're in there fishing. And now we're at the actually the end, the western end of the Alaska Highway. It's called Delta Junction. And so this is, if you were coming all the way in on the Alaska Highway, this is where you would end. And then you're still about 100 miles away from Anchorage at this point, or Fairbanks at this point. And so this shows, so here we are at Delta Junction at the far end of the Alaska Highway. And Tok is where we came into Alaska. And then Whitehorse is where we came up when we came up from the south. So now we're going to follow the Alaska Highway all the way back to Dawson Creek. And if you stay on the whole Alaska Highway, it's about 1,387 miles. And Dawson Creek is in British Columbia. So if you just get into British Columbia, that's the start of the Alaska Highway. And so this is a little marker that they have there at the end of the Alaska Highway. And as we were driving, continuing on, we got one good look at a moose. Not a very good picture here, but you can see this moose feeding along the road. And I took this picture just to show you what a typical road in Alaska looks like. Because of the permafrost, you get all of these dips and rises in the road. And so the speed limit might be 60 miles an hour, but you can only go about 45 miles an hour, especially if you're pulling a trailer, because you're constantly going up and down these ridges in the road. And again, there's no shoulders, they're elevated above the permafrost, so it's kind of interesting driving. Here again is another one of these big, huge burns that we went by, burned areas. And this is probably our favorite campsite. This is the West Fork Campground. We're still in Alaska here. This is our last campsite in Alaska. And it's a BLM campsite and right on a stream. And you can see there's even a bench there that overlooks the stream. So we really enjoyed our time here. And this is the view from that bench. Looks out over this river and then all this taiga and mountains in the distance. And to my surprise, there was a whole family of pintails on this river. And I think it was the mother and her brood for the year, because there seemed to be one duck that they were all following. And pintails are prairie ducks, and what they're doing out here in the middle of the taiga, I'm not sure, except there was probably not any water in the prairie, and this is where they ended up. But apparently they had a really productive year to be able to produce that many young pintails. And then there was a beaver swimming around there and also a muskrat. So we had quite a wildlife show while we were sitting in our campsite there drinking our coffee. The next day now we're heading out of Alaska, and the last town in Alaska that we went through is called Chicken, Alaska. And there's a chicken there. That's about all that's there. And this chicken was made out of lockers. The kids in the school made this chicken out of old lockers from their school. So why is it called chicken?
It's called Chicken Alaska because when the people decided to give their name, they wanted to call it ptarmigan, but they didn't know how to spell ptarmigan, so they called it chicken.
That's right. So this is called Chicken, Alaska because the people that lived here wanted to call it ptarmigan. But when the town was established, nobody in the town could figure out how to spell ptarmigan, but they knew how to spell chicken, so they decided to call it chicken. So that's how it got its name. And there's a sign there, and it gives the distance to all different cities all around the world that have chicken-like names. And the name of the chicken that the kids had made there was called Eggy. So it was kind of a cute little stop. And this is what the big town of Chicken looks like. Not a lot there. There's a gold dredging machine there that they dragged up from the Klondike to show you what a gold dredge looks like. We'll talk a little bit more about the gold dredge. We're going to make it to Dawson, the city of Dawson, pretty soon, which is where the gold rush guys were headed. And before we got there, we had to go over what's called the Top of the World Highway. And this is where we cross over from Alaska into the Yukon Territory. And the road is well named. It turns into a gravel road, and you're way above the tree line, winding around these incredible rolling mountains that seem to go on forever. And eventually, and this is just a view from that road. And like so many things in Alaska, everything is so big, and just as far as you can see is wild country. Without any development at all that you can see, and you drive for miles and miles and miles, and that's all you see. And finally, we got to the customs station, and talk about being out in the middle of nowhere. This is the northernmost border crossing between the US and Canada, and they sit right up at the top highest point of the pass. And so we went through customs there, and so now we're in back in Yukon Territory, and we stay above the tree line, and then finally at the end, there's a 14-kilometer hill down to the Yukon River. And again, that's the Yukon River, and we're coming to the city of Dawson right across the river. We got a campsite right on the river, and so we were able to sit right on the river and drink our coffee and watch the river go by. And I'm doing some barbecuing there. And build a fire and enjoying a beer next to the Yukon River. And it was just a beautiful evening as we were overlooking the river in this tall canyon. And now to get to Dawson on the other side of the river, we have to take a ferry. And this is the ferry, and the road here is the way you get onto the ferry. And the current is so strong that they back the ferry up here and you drive onto it and they get a half a dozen vehicles at a time on the ferry. And as soon as they go out, the thing just heads downstream. Then they have to turn around and head straight upstream to get to the other side. And just amazing how much current is in that river. And so this is where you unload on the other side. And now you're in the city of Dawson. And this is an aerial view of Dawson. And then this is the Klondike River on the right side of the picture here. And so this is where all those guys were headed during the Klondike Gold Rush. So it took them several months to get here. And once they got here, they found out that most of the gold claims were already taken by the time they got here, but this is where they were headed. And this is a map that just kind of shows again where Skagway was and Dyea. That's where they started. They got up on the Yukon River and then they took that all the way to Dawson. And then the map above that shows the Klondike River and all the tributaries into it. And this is where all the gold was. So when you hear about the Klondike Gold Rush, this is where they were headed. We did a little tour in Dawson and they have restored a number of the buildings in Dawson. And we had this gal that led a walking tour, about an hour and a half walking tour around town. It was really interesting. And the restored buildings are all built up on steps. So you have to walk up the steps to enter the building. And that's because of the permafrost. So they need some insulation between the bottom of the building and the ground so they don't melt the permafrost. And you can see buildings that the original buildings, and you can see how these buildings are slowly sinking into the ground. Because they weren't elevated above the permafrost when they built them. They didn't really understand the situation with the permafrost. So that's what Dawson looks like. And this gal did just a beautiful job, talking about the history of Dawson. And it was a town, small town in the late 1800s when the gold rush occurred, but it was primarily just a native village there and then a small town. And this is a picture that was taken inside. We're in a saloon here, and they took a picture of the original saloon, and then you can see that they restored it to exactly match the features that were in the picture, even to the point of having the same pictures on the wall that are in this picture that was taken in the 1890s. So pretty cool how they restored this stuff. This is a post office, and this is the bank. And of course, this is where when the miners found their gold, then they would bring it into the bank, and there would be a guy in the bank that knew how to check the gold to determine, the purity of the gold, and then figure out what it was worth. And they would give them cash for their gold. And then the guys would go in town and spend it on probably things that weren't things they should be spending it on. And most of them went home without much money. They've